So let's imagine that each of us is a marvelous puppet of the gods, whether we have been constructed to serve as their plaything or for some serious reason is something beyond our ken. But what we certainly do know is this: we have these emotions in us which act like chords or strings and tug us about and make us perform mutually opposed actions. And therein lies the division of virtue and vice. And that's from Plato's Laws, probably quoted by 100,000 people. And maybe there's a reason why, because I think there's some truth in the statement. That's the prologue. And then there's a short epilogue. And I have some images to show you, some of which I'll show while I'm talking and some when I'm finished. And if you do run out of here at any time, be careful on the steps, okay? You know, it'll take a little time to go through it. So for a while, I've been searching for ways to better understand the relevance of the idea of justice and its related idea of innocence with respect to the education of an architect. These kinds of questions came to my mind in the face of national conversations that were taking place related to those ideas. And then I began to wonder about the role of innocence in our education and how it could lead in really surprising ways to a very vital future practice of architecture. So some years ago, before a lot of you were here, Denise Scott Brown came to campus because she, along with her partner, Robert Venturi, had done a project on campus. So this is way back in the 60s. And then when we had the tragedy on campus, I think around April 2007, she sent a really touching email, I guess a condolence letter. And I heard about the letter, but I never really saw it. And I just wanted to read a bit from that letter. We found there, meaning this school, a place of infectious enthusiasm, overflowing energy, high endeavor, and naivete, of the type to keep all your life, because through it you retain a sense of wonder. Everything seemed possible to those young people, and you can see how they impressed us, because nearly 40 years later, we have not forgotten. So in the sadness of that moment, it was really telling that she raised this issue, this question of wonder. And it gave us some solace, I think, for, and it was really appreciated. So they were the initial architects, Denise Scott Brown and Robert Venturi, for the Newman Library addition at Virginia Tech. And, you know, so it got me wondering in terms of her letter, you know, about the ethos of wonder that might give birth to innocence in the School of Architecture. So wonder, along with curiosity, with its characteristic rapidity, is jettisoned by our own desire to know, and it allows us to patiently dwell upon what we might know and the things we cannot know. Sometimes curiosity moves very quickly, and that's important. Wonder may stop you. It may stop you in your tracks. So I'm wondering, right, whether these questions might be avenues to help us rediscover our innocence. If the work of a philosopher begins in wonder, as Aristotle wrote, maybe the education of an architect may find its beginnings there as well. It's important, though, to realize that Aristotle said you begin in wonder, but you don't end in wonder. And you can't stay at that level. You have to, in a way, test it, refine your wonder, right? But it's a place, and it may be the only place to begin. And he felt one way to refine our wonder was to think about the causes of things. And they became known as these famous four causes, right? Everyone knows them. Material cause, efficient cause. By the way, that would be maybe the architect, right? The material is what it's made out of. The formal cause, which is the aspect of a thing. What makes a chair a chair? What makes a table, a house a house? And then a final cause, which is the sort of the ultimate purpose for which a thing exists, not simply its function, but the purposeness of it all. So wonder does not give us knowledge, but it's a place to begin. The acquisition of knowledge is an attempt to escape from ignorance, but it always risks forgetting its beginnings in wonder. So in other words, as we know something, we may forget, in a way, its origins, where it began. And the questions that we have express our simple perplexity about the world. Why is that the case? Little kids have an amazing ability to ask those questions. As we get older, we're afraid to ask those fundamental questions. So innocence was so naturally within the little hill of our childhood. And it seems to slowly disappear as we move into a more mountainous adulthood. Perhaps innocence is always innocence lost, but the recollection, and that's important, I'll come back to the idea, the recollection of a lost innocence retains a vestige of innocence. There's always some kind of fall involved, as if innocence occupied an upper region we fall from. If we fall down from innocence, how do we reach back upwards towards it? We need to find ways to live imaginatively. In other words, that's one strategy, if you can call that a strategy. The poet Samuel Coleridge believed imagination was and this is just a fancy word, but bear with me, esimplastic, or formative unifying power that can overcome the unceasing mechanisms of matter and motion. Remember, anytime you try to build something, you're going to be up against matter and motion. So Archimedes famously said that if you give me a lever, I can lift the world. But there's one thing the lever can't do. It can't, in a way, help us poeticize the meaningfulness of the world. St. Thomas Aquinas was a theologian. You may not know of him. Actually, his classmates made fun of him. He was a little portly, and when he sat down to eat, they cut a little crescent out of the table, and they nicknamed him the dumb ox. And his teacher said something really beautiful. He said, Thomas, when you do speak, the whole world will listen. What a great teacher Thomas had. So he thought innocence was something natural, almost a natural law that resided in the highest, most delicate, uncorrupted region of the soul, where innocence was preserved and protected. This part of the soul served as a guide to our conscience and was the seat of the gleam or scintilla, which means very little, tiny, scintilla of conscience. Innocence as a form of grace is guided by a simple rule. He called it the rule of synderesis, which simply means do good and avoid evil. It's so simple. But it's hard to live that. So innocence is never pure or isolated from the larger world we live in. It seems to be something, though, very, very fragile. And it may be necessary to make a defense or apology for innocence in the education of an architect. So I'm not saying by apology, I'm sorry. Certainly that's one meaning of apology. This is an older idea coming from ancient Greece, which had to do with what they called a speaking away. It's a special kind of speaking, or logos, that refutes or repulses a charge of injustice against someone. That's what apology means, and maybe it always means that. And maybe saying you're sorry has something to do with sort of calibrating the justice of a situation. So it's an innocent phrase, I'm sorry. It's hard to say, actually. The most famous example I know of is Plato's dialogue that recounts the trial of Socrates, entitled Apology. And if you read the Apology, you can find out how the story turned out. So raising the question of innocence is not intended to deny or simplify the extremely complex conditions of a professional education and important considerations regarding professional responsibility and expertise. These two words in succession, professional education, have always intrigued me. By putting these two words together, it places a unique responsibility on teachers and students of architecture. It's a difficult but necessary duality. So just what constitutes an excellent professional education? Surely there's a productive tension between developing a certain expertise, and it might be technical, historical, aesthetic, or something else, and knowing or wondering about oneself. So how do we keep those two things in play? I think it might be a bit of a mistake to think innocence has no rigor. Think of the elaborate rules children make up and change as they play. I'm sure you've all done that as a young child. You just sort of change the rules on the fly to your advantage. For a young child, the floor is their first table, and the space under a table can magically become a playroom or a playhouse. A former colleague reminded me of the floor of innocence being a reflection of the heights from which we fall, a kind of piano nobile. The high limit of innocence is rather ironically brought down and made present in the floor. So just think about the floor of Kogolabi and the marvelous things that can be placed upon it. I think that the duality of education and practice can be somewhat weakened in fundamental ways by unintentionally de-emphasizing innocence or overlooking its gentle presence. What are the consequences of this upon the soul of a student, a teacher, and an architect? The school as a place might level out, in other words, become less of a place. The profession might lack the boost of energy that it really needs from the next generation, and students may come to view the foundation of their education as something irrelevant to be quickly discarded. Alumni often return to visit our school and joyfully reconnect with their innocent past that has taken them deep into their lives. Many tell us that returning energizes them. I think it's the same thing that Denise Scott Brown experienced. The weakening of innocence, and I'm not playing with language, or the loss of innocence, may be partly due to an unintentional, lingering and emergent bourgeois attitude prevalent among us, tending to stamp out a belief in innocence and wonder as a spur to better action. And sooner or later, one of the slides will come up, teach you how to pronounce the word. Crudely, you could say it means middle class, but it's a complex idea, and it has virtue and vice in it. If many of us might be considered part of the so-called middle class, that is a vestige of the rise of certain socioeconomic conditions in Europe in which people left agrarian settings for a different kind of life and the density of cities and villages, sometimes called bourgs. The word bourgeois is the term for this social class or classes, which it should be noted is not without virtue. The name of the town Blacksburg is related to all of this. If you remember the first lecture last semester, Professor Galloway spoke about the idea of leisure and its relation to the idea of a school. And I think we learned leisure is not an excuse to be lazy any more than innocence is an excuse to be ignorant. Leisure and innocence play basic formative roles in education and the building of culture. Corbusier's paintings, I think, which Bill showed, and sculptures, in other words, work done outside the office, were wonderful examples of work done in leisure and at a remove from his office practice. I think these somewhat innocent activities like Corbusier were essential to his practice of architecture. After Bill's lecture, I bought a copy of that book because I never had the leisure to read it. It's called Leisure, the Basis of Culture. And this passage really hit me, and it gave rise to this talk. Pieper writes, and this is a bit paraphrased, wonder is really unbourgeois. For what do we mean by saying in a spiritual sense that something is bourgeois? Above all, in the first place, that a person accepts their environment defined as it is by the immediate needs of life, so completely and finally that things happening cannot any longer become transparent. The great, wide, not to say deep world, which is at first sight invisible, the world of essences and universals, is not even suspected. Nothing wonderful ever happens in this world, and wonder itself is unknown or lost. This was in the Wall Street Journal some months ago, but I got a kick out of it. These people are being sort of trained to get into Harvard, the 11, 10-year-olds, and they pay this person, and he can get you into Harvard. Damn, I wish I knew about this. I wish I knew about this. But it's interesting. I'm not just poking fun at it. It's a real thing. But maybe the individuals are being kind of induced without their knowledge of growing up too fast. I guess you could grow up too fast or too slow. Find the rhythm. A loss of wonder may be also a loss of innocence. An unchecked bourgeois stance can serve to dampen our natural desire to know with the promise of a more comfortable, maybe cushy certainty. Wonder is closer to an encounter with piety and holiness, something that might be alien to aspects of a bourgeois stance. More recently, there have been variants of the word bourgeois. One of them is called bougie. And so, in other words, you go to the mall and you say, oh, this mall is so bougie. Right? I don't know if you've heard that word. There are other variants, right? You're kind of making fun of it, but you're still participating in it, right? I think the less positive aspects of a bourgeois mentality is still in the air. And we might consider offering resistance and not succumbing to its soul and spirit numbing effects. This mentality can expunge innocence and make a world bereft of wonder. Can there be a world without wonder? It would be a world without a beginning. The Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard expressed similar sentiments. He thought, and he called them petty or Philistine bourgeois, there's many, many kinds, have been caught up in the orbit of trivial experiences as to how things come about and what's possible, what usually happens. It is a world devoid of any inwardness or self-reflection. It's an external world that has been de-spiritualized. Have we unwittingly taken up that pose which freezes the status quo, making our thinking and acting into cliches? This was a story that Shelley pointed me to. Can you read that in the back? Okay, I'll leave it up. If philosophy is unbourgeois, as Joseph Pieper believes, so might architecture, at least the education of an architect. What are the implications and consequences of the idea of innocence in terms of a pedagogical foundation? With innocence, one is brought back to the time of their childhood. Children's stories, for example, so much a part of childhood are really stories written by and for adults. They're first read to children by adults. Recall the stories of Pinocchio, Peter Pan, and Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. In some cases, these stories are not completely innocent and have very ominous, fearful, and even violent moments. In such stories, the wishes of children and the fears of adults are both present. These are some phrases in a book that I found. And you've heard them. Business is business, all those things. Time is money. And the more you say them, the more you start, in a way, believing them. So let me talk a little bit about about cubes. I've seen thousands of cubes, or more precisely cubic forms, on studio desks and in our lobby for almost the last 40 years. Perhaps similar to what Denise Scott Brown saw a long time ago. They have been made in every imaginable material, color, and assembly. I mean, it is really extraordinary, the variety of cubic forms. And at first glance, they may appear innocent and naive. A former faculty member, the late Professor Gene Egger, once stopped me in mid-walking, right? And he said, you know, Frank, there should always be lots of cubes in the school. And that was the full extent of the conversation. There should be lots of cubes in the school. And I thought, wow, now that is really brilliant. You know? Wow. I mean, so what do you do with that? Well, it's taken me a long time to think about what he might have meant, or what let's say my misinterpretation of what he said. I do not think he said it lightly. And at the time, I even detected a tone of cultivated naivete in his voice, a kind of learned innocence. In other words, he was purposely being innocent, consciously innocent. His casualness belied a deeper understanding about the basic foundations of cubicity in the education of an architect. It may be time to do justice to the cube and the role of cubicity in the education of an architect. I'll show you some innocent characters of some films that you may or may not know, and most likely television shows, which are references that older faculty give to you, probably mean nothing to you, but you can look some of these up. I think they're worth seeing. Just think about how the preponderance of so many cubic forms in such close proximity. Let's say you're in a studio. On each desk, there's a cubic form, right? You have a miniature laboratory or playground for your geometric urbanism right in front of you. Right, what does that cube have to do with the other one, right? Immediately, the cube leads to the other cubes. Kind of conversation takes place between these geometries. So what is it about the cube that makes it so important in the foundation of our education? And I think it goes well into the upper years of your study and perhaps even into practice. Why is it part of the ground condition of architectural pedagogy? You have to realize, at least I've come to realize, you can't build a cube because it's an idea, it's an ideal. It has no material, it has no weight, it has no surface. There's no shade, there's no shadow, it can't crack. So you can't build a cube, but you can work with the idea of a cube as an analogy. In other words, a deeper relationship, a proportion towards a rectified, differentiated, cubic, crystalline form. Remember, it's an analogy, not a literal, I'm not talking about a literal thing. This might be what architecture is in an analogical sense. Maybe that's also why it's hard to learn architecture. Because without analogy, it's really hard to make that connection. That's Chauncey Gardner. Yeah, this is a great film if you haven't seen it. It's amazing. And, you know, Chauncey is a gardener, right? I mean, but he's brilliant. He gives advice to the president. I think it's worth seeing. This is a show that only, it went into reruns quickly, but you see the guy with the hat. He was always kind of confused and innocent, and Jackie Gleason is on the left, having that look like he's not innocent. He knows the truth. But Ed Norton with his pork pie hat hasn't a clue. And somehow he gets by. Ed's job was he worked in the sewer, you know, but he never came home dirty. I'm not sure exactly how that worked. These were television shows that essentially were in one room things, kind of like Seinfeld. That apartment was the set, right? And only ran for a year. And look at that tablecloth, you know. Pretty amazing. The cube is an ideal rule-based geometric form made of points, lines, planes, and angles, which demonstrate general geometric axioms of connection, order, parallels, congruence, and continuity. In other words, that gives you a lot to work with. Imagine if we take that off the table. No connection, no order, no parallels, no congruence, no continuity. Very hard to proceed. There's Barney Fife on the left, my left, and Gomer Pyle. Also, the cube has some special secrets within it. One of the most being dynamic symmetry. Because the diagonal of a cube is not a calculable length, it's a proportion. It's one of those numbers that doesn't end, known as an irrational number. So hidden within the rational structure of the cube, irrational structure of the diagonal, it cannot be measured. There is no whole number that represents that diagonal. But what that diagonal does is allows you to construct proportionally. Might come back to that. The late scholar Michel Serres saw in geometry, which was a part of his larger search for foundations, a rare, what he called quasi-perfect structure of communication with multiple and mysterious origins. Geometry was often more trusted than words. Almost like a diagram of truth in a way, right? Serres has suggested we should be looking for artificial memory rather than artificial intelligence, or at least maybe build in the AI, what I call AM. For Serres, geometry is a form of artificial memory that spans millennia. I think it's interesting that it might relate his idea to the Platonic idea of anamnesis. It's a fancy word that means recollection. In other words, when you work with geometry, it's something that seems to be pre-existing. It's not something that you create. It's already there. You just somehow find it. So this idea of anamnesis or recollection, it means the things that we learn are actually believed to be innately already present before we learn within our soul. And the moment of learning, if there is such a moment, brings forth this recollection. Geometry might be one of those things that is just deeply lodged innately. And the role of the teacher is to act as a midwife towards this spontaneity. I couldn't think of a better word. It's a moment of spontaneity when you learn something. But you have to give recollection credit, not your teacher, because it was already there. It was always there. So Serres, following Socrates, equates geometry with equality. I found that very interesting as we think about these questions of justice. He equates geometry with equality, which forms the basis of a community. The rule of geometric equality pushes back against trying to get the better of someone. We are all equal within the limits, postulates, and axioms of geometry. Dolores Hart was an actress I didn't know about. She played in 4 or 5 films with Elvis Presley, and she later became an ordained nun, leaving a really successful career. I think it's an example. Believe me, don't go tell your parents you're switching majors, okay? But the fact is she had these moments, and she went that way. She still stayed friends with the folks in Hollywood. In fact, she kind of taught acting at the monastery, and they put on plays. Really remarkable person. I think she showed up to the Academy Awards around 2012. So Ceres sought an origin before the origin of geometry. And he talked about when the Nile River flooded, it erased the individual plots of land, and measure allowed agricultural plots to be diagrammatically reestablished in a way language could not. I mean, imagine trying to do that with language. Geometry gave a new possibility not only to measure, but to construct proportionally. The diagonal of the square was a proportion, not a measurable finite length. With geometry, a volumetric conception of space was born, or what we might call mass. Those that study geometry intently, especially solid geometry, will find avenues to architectural propositions they might not otherwise find. Remember, it was geometry that saved the innocence of the Sydney Opera House. And just very briefly, there was a kind of sketch that was made by the architect, a gesture of the roof, and it came down to him figuring out that this could be parts of a sphere, which gave them the geometric control that helped them construct something. It's very hard to construct something that doesn't have a basis in geometry. I'm not saying you can't do it, but you're really fighting like a two-front war, right? So I think there's a link, might be quite profound, between the proliferating power of geometry and the preservation of innocence. Certain children's toys, like the Freuble gifts, do seem to suggest this. It's the pedagogical cultivation of an innocent imagination. The cube as a brightly colored children's toy becomes a form of indelible magical geometry, attracting and priming their imaginations. So I think the cube is a little bit like a pedagogical brick, and when you understand it proportionally, if you think of the golden section, an architect can be aesthetically and ethically constructed course by course. The so-called Platonic or Pythagorean solids consisted of only 5 perfectly symmetrical solids. The tetrahedron, a pyramid bounded by 4 equilateral triangles. The cube, bounded by 6 squares. The octahedron, bounded by 8 equilateral triangles. The dodecahedron, bounded by 12 pentagons. And the icosahedron, bounded by 20 equilateral triangles. I know that's a mouthful, but these are the only 5. Geometrically, the Platonic solids are understood as solids because their intelligible structure is transparent to us, like the Villa Rotunda of Palladio, which I might call a Palladian solid. These ethical solids have been found latent in ancient carved stones. Sorry, I don't have that image. In what today is Scotland, that date around 3200 to 1500 BC, attesting that geometry is not a local phenomenon. Imagine we go to some other planet and find geometry. Now that would be something. For context, Plato was born in the 4th century BC and died in the 3rd century BC. So that rule-bound cube resists exceptions. But exceptions can be found in the form of cubic physical analogies that are hard-won. Think of Scarpa's corner cubic window, and that slide will come at some point. Placed high up in the ceiling in the corner of the plaster casting gallery in Posagno, Italy, or Wright's famous corner window at Falling Water, where in the open position the cube is doubled. The cube stubbornly resists the messiness of our physical world, our participation in that world, and our efforts towards acts of concretization. In other words, making things physical. Perhaps that's part of the intrigue of the cube, its untouchable utopic impossibility. Differentiating a cube is an impossibility, as it already has all that it needs to be beautiful. Anything that's added or taken away would diminish its beauty. So we sit and sometimes stand, as Hannah Arendt believed, between the separateness of ideas residing in the life of the mind and the active participatory nature of our lives. The novelist Albert Camus, in his Nobel laureate address, spoke of a beauty one cannot do without and a community one cannot tear themselves away from. Think of that puppet being pulled in these directions. A beauty one cannot do without and a community one cannot tear themselves away from. One of my former teachers, Kenneth Frampton, recently reminded me the rift between ethics and politics is indeed substantial. By the way, he's about to become 95, and he's still giving lectures. I promise not to give a lecture at 95, so don't worry. Doing justice to the cube. If a cube is thought of as a simple form which demonstrates the equitable and ethical distribution of fairness in all directions, then we might say justice is a perfect cube. Beauty, as Elaine Scarry has eloquently written, can lead us to justice. In other words, we're interested in justice, but we forgot about beauty. It's a good reminder. The Russian-born poet and essayist Joseph Brodsky expressed a related idea when he said, "Aesthetics is the mother of ethics." It's not surprising that statues representing Lady Justice sit on a throne on top of a stable cubic base. She would fall off a spherical form, even though the sphere has an all too perfect perfection that exceeds that of the cube. And she would be subjected to the vagaries of chance, permanence, stability, chance, fate, destiny. These are all bound together in the adventure of our lives. The cube and the sphere serve as beautiful reminders to architects about both the stability and provisionality of our lives, of which architecture is a part. So I'm close to the end, and then I'd like to show some slides. One should not be under the illusion innocence or wonder can somehow be transformed directly into architecture or building, because building requires craft, practical wisdom, and a desire towards reaching the better. Sometimes innocence can lead to a kind of carelessness, and wonder can become a kind of stupefying crutch that immobilizes us against further action. Innocence is an archetypal part of our inner psychic life. Just remember, though, that in architecture, it's important to work from, in, and through the principles or elements of architecture. For example, principles, and I call them principles rather than elements. Doors, principle of doors, windows, columns, beams, stairs, floors, ceilings, roofs, all towards culture, towards culture. So working with these principles or architectural primitives can lead to wonderful architectural conditions and social contributions. Both are possible. It may be more fruitful, or at least think about this possibility, to work from material to culture rather than from culture to material. I think as a young architect, it might be, seductive or attractive to work from culture to material. But I think as an architect, they say, let not the cobbler go above the sole, meaning the sole of your shoe. You have to work within your discipline to reach other things. So as human beings, we have a very long period of gestation and infancy and childhood. It extends, as many believe, across our entire lives. In this sense, we stay younger longer. Imagine these kids. When I was a kid, I never saw a Cy Twombly. Imagine seeing that as a 3 or 4-year-old. So there's a prolongation to our human infancy that is easy to overlook. The long childhood, which is our lives, allows for tremendous growth and complexity in the development of our intelligence and imagination, should we elect to exercise these endowments throughout our lives. The long durée of childhood runs deep into the fabric of adulthood. Teaching and learning are the act of staying young. How long can you remain pedagogically innocent? We are juvenescent creatures, such that we are young no matter our age. The term juvenescence describes this primary condition of human natality or beginnings as the innocent, incipient bridge to the next generation. There's the cubic corner window in Posano, which I really want to get to. Marvelous space. By the way, the locals really resisted this project with all their might. Escarpa just sort of took the slings and arrows, as he did when people claimed he wasn't a licensed architect. Brilliant. The people that work with him, they called him the professor. They looked up to him. So architecture has a capacity to enlighten our lives, make us feel more human, and awaken our consciousness from its adult slumber. I think this relates to the idea of plastic emotion Corbusier so patiently searched for. He made emotion solid. And this gets us to, slowly, to La Tourette, of course. The convent of La Tourette is infused by this feeling. I will show you some images soon. The trace of the wooden formwork impresses its sylvan origins into the surfaces of the concrete. So when you go there, you can see that it came from wood. It didn't come from concrete. Mass, thickness, and surface are activated by light, shadow, and shade. And this all adds up to an emotional component, both in terms of what we see and what is hidden. This Kogel lobby, if you don't recognize it, and more so-called cubes. Seen one cube, seen them all. No, that's not true. Actually, Robert Stern, in a class I took with him, he was talking about the Chicago window, and he said, "Oh, you've seen one Chicago window, you've seen them all." That really that hurt me. That hurt me. The risk is the masses of our buildings and the education that presuppose them may not rise wonderfully towards the heavens so that we are moved. The risk is we have motion without emotion. The soulful movement Corbusier speaks of takes us back to the fragile and tiny region of the soul that St. Thomas Aquinas wrote about, a place of plastic innocence. The late architect and educator John Haydock once spoke about the solidities of space. These spatial solidities and material plasticities are the inchoate glimmer and ineffable airing of the innocent conscience of an architect. I know that you can't see that painting, but it's a very fine grid that Agnes Martin drew on the canvas. It is called Tree. To paraphrase the late architect Luigi Snozzi, who was born just a few miles from the Steger Center in Riva San Vitale, and I know there are some students that might be here that just returned from there. What he said in a number of places and a number of times, I'm paraphrasing, an architect without a conscience is a disaster. It's a true disaster, right? So one of the questions I have is, what role does the education of an architect play in cultivating the silent whispers of innocence? Short epilogue and some images. This is from a piece called On the Marionette Theater, written by Heinrich Kleist. These puppets possess the virtue of being immune to gravity's force. They know nothing of the inertia of matter, the quality of which, above all, is diametrically opposed to the dance, because the force that lifts them into the air is greater than the force that binds them to the earth. This is sort of a tourist thing that they do, especially in Italy. They'll call this tree the oak of Pinocchio. I think Pinocchio might have been made from pine, but that doesn't matter. This is the myth, and it's sort of beautiful. I call it tourism scholarship, you know. There's a lot of stories about this tree. Some are ominous and some aren't. Yeah, you have to read Pinocchio. Collodi, the person who wrote Pinocchio, didn't live far from this tree. And the Italians like to think that he wrote part of Pinocchio sitting under this tree. I guess right next to Isaac Newton, you know, probably. But what a tree. You see them, you see these oak trees that grow this way, you know, out like that. The oak of Pinocchio. I think I drove past it. They say it's very hard to find. So you can go search for it if you want. On my way, the first time I went to the convent, I think it's a convent, not a monastery, of La Tourette, Nivaux, France, we had an article in the bus written by Colin Rowe. And so I read that and had no idea what he was talking about. I mean, I'm a teacher, I've never been there. Students, of course, have never been there. And it was interesting that Frampton reminded me of this article. He said, oh, of course you know the brilliant article by Colin Rowe. Yes, I do. Thank you, Professor. I do. It's amazing how long someone stays your teacher. You'll be checking back with some of your teachers. In the article, he says, as the church is approached, meaning La Tourette, the site which had initially seemed so innocent in its behavior becomes a space rifted and plowed up into almost unbridgeable chasms. So it's filled with contradictions and paradox and irony, of course. How could you have a life without those three things? So when you go there, they used to allow the bus to go along this street, but they stop you, and that's beautiful in a way, especially when it's raining or snowing, because then you have to lug everything down this allée of trees, right? So I think Rowe is right. It does feel so innocent. And interestingly, when you follow this and you walk past the church if you want to, because you have to make a right turn, I'll show you a little bit, it returns to innocence. So that's very interesting, that innocence is paused by the building and then reclaimed by the path. That just skims right by it. You might walk by La Tourette and not even know that you've got to make a right turn. How do you even get in? Where's the entrance? So it opens up to what Rowe described very beautifully. I don't have a pointer, but you'll see a bench near that stairway, and there's a little bit of a cubic form that you walk through, and that's how you find your way in and check in. And there are these irregular forms, two of them at the entrance, which particularly intrigued me for this question of innocence. I would say they're rather innocent. One time I showed up there and there was a bunch of Coke cans and wine bottles out there. And I said, our group, of course, is not going to do that, right? But people go there and they don't quite necessarily respect the place. But you see, I don't know what to call it. Non-geometric is not a fair word, but there are these forms. And obviously, at one level, they stop you from walking off a ledge. And in some cases, it's like a 20-foot drop. So you could say, well, they're bollards. But I think there are a lot more. There are a lot more than that. And there are two of them. So I wrote Florence Damey, who has helped probably, I don't know, 100 groups, would you say, go to La Tourette? I don't know how many more Virginia Tech students and faculty have been to La Tourette than any school in the world. And we keep going back, and you wonder why. I think there's a reason. So her name is Florence Damey. So I wrote her and asked her about these forms at the entrance. Dear sir, we are glad to know that Mr. Doan and the students appreciated the convent. I thank them for you, Patrick. Yeah, I hope you wrote your thank you letter. So when I do a tour and talk about these concrete elements, here is my explanation. There are some, and remember, this is her second language, so give her some leeway. There are some non-geometric forms and functionless elements. They are transitioned between the regular benches and the round wall of the reception desk. Indeed, they alert people that nothing, and she has it in quotes, happens behind them, and it doesn't stop them totally. In other words, you can circumvent these. You can walk around them, you can walk on them. The structure of the free plan is still clear. My goodness, we need to have her on the faculty. That's pretty interesting. The structure of the free plan, the plan libre, one of his 5 points, is still clear. There are some small pipes. I think she means openings. You'll see there's some holes that penetrate this terrible diagram that I found because I couldn't find my pamphlet. You see that circle? There are two specks inside that circle. Those are these two forms. You can see what they do. They block you. The one near number 3, that's a real drop. And the other one is a slight drop that you see on the way to it. And the arrow turns you 90 degrees from where you walked to enter to find a way to sort of check in. You can stay at La Tourette. So there are some small pipes, maybe to arrange some flowers and let the water go out. But it's not used for this. A lot of people use them as ashtrays, but they are not. So she's probably had to stop people from putting their cigarettes out in there. So here's my story. There may be, and she says, there may be lots of other points of view, and some of you may have other thoughts about these forms. A friar used to joke about them. He said that it could be the leftover concrete at the end of the project, which Corbusier simply said, put it there. So we don't really know the story, and I'm not here to tell you what it is, because I wasn't there at the time. Okay? That's what you always say, I wasn't there. I wish you all the best. Florence Damey, in charge of reception and booking. Really nice person. So you walk down that alley and you come to this form and you walk through. The building is behind me. And there's a little closer look at that curious thing. And I can't tell you how many times I've passed that and didn't think anything of it. You know, I never discussed it. I never talked about it. No one ever asked me, what are they for? What are they doing? But I'll tell you one thing, the more you look at those, the more precise the building appears. In other words, the contrast between these sort of sculptures and the architectural construction is really intense. And this béton brut becomes very, very precise when he puts these two things in play. And Corbusier was very good at contrasting things. And there you can see the bench being used and that form. And just about everyone just ignores it. Now, I don't read French, but I haven't found much speculation about these things. And then maybe it's just my problem. Why is it so interesting? You know? I think it has to do with innocence, right? This plastic emotion that Corbusier wrote about. And then some more photos at different times. There you can really see the roughness of that thing. And there are some pipes actually that allow some of the water that goes in to come out. So she was right with using the word pipes. I found an artist who actually studied these forms as an artist, not as an architect. And he brought a crew of people, including this incredible camera, and he made an exhibition about them. And the exhibition was called Speculation About Two Unidentified Objects. That camera is not one of those objects. He's talking about the two sort of blobs that are there. Amazing camera. And you can see there are some folks that came to La Tourette, and then I was with a group of students, and they immediately walked around it. and found a great perch. But you got to wonder, what are those folks thinking about? Like, I would have loved to ask him, because they're curious too. Like, what the heck is that? You know, let alone what she might be drawing. This is a photographer that Corbusier worked with. And there's Corbusier holding a rock in his little cabin by Lake of Geneva. You can see the level of curiosity and wonder that Corbusier had about something as simple as this piece in his hand. It eerily similar to what he built at La Tourette, just a larger version. And when you see photographs of La Tourette, it's rare actually to see these forms show up because they kind of disturb the logical, coherence of the project. I don't think they do. I think they make the project even more coherent. They're an exception. There's a beautiful book called Contact, and it's really nice to see just the vitality of these contact prints. And if you look carefully across the courtyard, you'll see that second bench. So in both cases, they're kind of brothers or sisters to a bench. And this is where the drop is 2 stories. Well, actually, you fall onto that parapet and then bounce down to the ground. That's from the courtyard. And I think the photo is very recent from the last group. Thank you. Where you can see that drop. But if you do go to La Tourette, get on that perch and sit. It's one of the best places to be in the whole convent. And just a couple more, we'll be finished. I don't intend to show you La Tourette introduction, but there's something in this, in the church space that is also strikes you, whether it's your curiosity or wonder about architecture. And it's in the pews. So you go down and you sit in the pew and you realize that the armrests are alternating convex and concave. And, why would he do that? It's not logical. But it's very interesting how your body reacts to the difference between the convexity and the concavity. And you're kind of pulled apart in 2 directions. I mean, he's kind of making you a puppet in a way, right? Even if you already are a puppet, right? But it really affects, it's a strange feeling for those that have been there and seen that. And I think there are probably more conditions at La Tourette like this. These are maybe 2 very, very obvious ones. This is not a spontaneous picture. I asked one of the students, would you please sit down? Because one day I thought maybe that image would be important. So like 20 years later, I'm showing that image. I should pay her a fee for using the photo. I'm embarrassed I don't have her name on the photo. But what's your body to think of the simultaneous experience of convexity and concavity? Like what do you do? Sometimes you just say, I don't know. I just don't know. And so to end, once upon a time, there was a king. My little readers will say at once, no, children, you are wrong. Once upon a time, there was a piece of wood. That's all I've got. Thanks.